to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Hey folks, thank you for joining us. I'm Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. I want to encourage you to participate, which you can easily do by clicking that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Give us questions, give us good questions, give us tough questions. We love those. You'll also see just next to it the live transcript gives you closed captioning if you would like that. So, take advantage of that feature if you'd like. Let's jump right in. I'm thrilled to have a terrific set of guests today. Kirsten Kukowski is a prominent Republican political communications expert. She was in charge of communications for Scott Walker's presidential campaign and was a communications director for the Republican National Committee. She is currently the vice president of she's currently the president of the woman-owned and operated public relations firm K2 and Company. We're also joined by Rebecca Pearcey, who is a prominent Democratic strategist. She directed Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign, overseeing strategy in 57 states and territories. She is currently vice president of public affairs for the Bryson Gillette firm. Thank you both for joining us. It's great to have you back.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So let's jump right in. If we look at the polling for the presidential election, and particularly the battleground states, there's 7 of them. They're toss-ups. They're all within about 2 points. With the margin of error, it's really not a good idea to be making predictions based on these very narrow leads. And so my question to you is, what is going on? I've been thinking back on what's happened over the last, year. We had the trial and convictions of Donald Trump in the spring. There are a lot of people saying, oh, this is it for Trump, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of impact right now. We've now gone through a series of debates, presidential debate. One was terrific for Donald Trump, another one less terrific. We had a vice presidential debate. We've got hurricanes. We've got a Middle East war. And still the race is just, it looks like it's stuck in concrete. Rebecca, how do you interpret all this kind of action and turbulence and the race remains so stable?
You just mentioned some really monumental things that have been happening, and it occurs to me that who's taking the time to really respond to these polls. And I think that what I am telling my campaigns, particularly in these states that are really tough, is you've got to run through the tape and not really pay attention to a lot of the polling. It's just too tight. And I don't know that they are completely reliable sources at this point, just given how static each of these polls has been in all of the battleground states since the spring, right? And so it was first Biden and Trump polling and being really tight and tied in a lot of these places. And now it's Harris-Trump tied in a lot of these places. And yes, we've seen some ups and downs, and they'll switch the lead, but it's still so closely within the margin of error that I do believe most of these swing states are toss-ups at this point, and will remain so until ballots are actually counted and certified.
So you dropped in there a metaphor that's familiar to people who race or run through the tape.
Yeah.
What is that piece of political?
That means don't let up. Don't let up, and make sure that you are turning out your voters all the way to the end. That means you make a plan and you figure out how to stay with the plan all the way through election night, right? And so, you know, I've worked on campaigns where it's easy to see that you're going to win, and it's easy to divert resources to a down ballot race or to help out your lieutenant governor candidate. And I think at this point, it's like every candidate for themselves. And so I think that's a really important point, particularly in these battleground states where you know the top of the ticket, it's what's driving a lot of the turnout, but where you're not going to be able to really see what happens until election night.
Kirsten, how are you reading this situation with turbulence in the world and a campaign, particularly at the presidential level, that's so static?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Rebecca said. I think there's so much turbulence. We've been saying this probably, you know, since probably COVID, right? And maybe even a little bit before that. There's so much turbulence in the world that I think a lot of people are tuning it out. And I think they're looking more inward in some ways to their own lives. And I think that, you know, that's why I think you see the economy still driving the news. And also you kind of have this, like, you know, the safety, like my community, you know, like, I think that's why immigration is such a big deal right now. I think they're looking to see how immigration is impacting their community with fentanyl. And I think they're tying it to kind of safety. And so I think people are looking inward in a lot of ways, even though that seems really contradictory to Rebecca's statement, which I agree with, which is the national, you know, the top of the ticket is definitely still driving politics today. And so it's a look inward at how this is impacting your life on a day-to-day basis, tuning out all of the turbulence as much as you can. And so I do agree that, you know, running through the tape is definitely a must. I mean, you wake up today and you see, you know, Deb Fischer in Nebraska, U.S. Senator, is now in a very close race, and people are starting to have to pay attention to that. Ted Cruz woke up a couple of weeks ago, and that is, you know, I think that people are seeing that it's going to be a tougher race. I think you have a lot of races, and I'm sure there's ones on the Democrat side too. Well, actually, like New York, Republicans are actually feeling very bullish about the state of New York and congressional races there. And so I think that regardless of your party, regardless of what state you're in and how red or blue it is, you're going to have to look at the turbulence and just the nature of our politics today. And I think you need to run through the tape and make sure that you're turning out your voters. So I think that's going to be the name of the game. And we're not going to know until election night and probably a few days later, unfortunately, how this is all going to shake out.
The folks who are tuning in and thought that you guys would say, here's what's going to happen, are going to be
They were wrong.
No,
Yeah.
No one knows.
No one knows. Okay, that's a good way to
We're
put
so
it.
complimentary. Like, we make the VP debate look mean. Like, we're like, right.
We're kind of talking in general terms, but of course, you folks think about slicing and dicing the electorate, and there are different parts of the electorate. Kirsten, you were referring to folks who might be moved by the border issues. But let's just talk briefly about folks who might be impacted by what's happening. We've got a war brewing, quite hot in the Middle East. Israel's war in Gaza, and now spreading to Lebanon, maybe to Iran, is not national news as much as you might think for voters, but it seems to be having a big impact on Arab Americans, particularly in the critical state of Michigan. Rebecca, do you have a sense of how that might play out for the presidential race and perhaps for some of the other races?
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting note that international politics doesn't really have a platform here on this presidential race, and voters are looking more inward at their own kitchen tables to figure out which way they're going to vote. I think Michigan is probably the lone exception in terms of battleground states, and I do think it's something that both the presidential and the federal races there in Michigan, particularly that Slotkin-Rogers race for U.S. Senate, have paid a lot of attention to in order to court those voters who are more active on international issues, particularly Gaza, Palestine, Israel at this point, and figuring out, you know, what does a protest vote look like in this case? How do you make sure your voice is heard given the choices at the top of the ticket? And so I do think that there has been more of an effort made to court those voices, at least on the Democratic side. And, you know, that primaries were super late for the federal races in Michigan. So in particular, those congressional primaries that we had because of a couple of vacancies there as well.
Yeah, if you go back to 2020, about 70% of the Arab American vote went for the Democrat, Joe Biden. And that's probably not going to happen this year. Are you a little surprised, Rebecca, that Kamala Harris hasn't done more to try to create a little bit of distance between herself and the Biden administration's policies in Gaza?
Um, no, I'm really not surprised. And here's why. It's a really political answer, so it may sound crass, but I mean, when she was made the nominee 2.5 months ago, there was a lot of work to do. And so there's only so much daylight you can create in that amount of time when you are thrust into the spotlight and into the nomination at this point. So I do think that she has figured out where she's going to make some different policy choices, different policy proposals, which you have seen sort of in this media onslaught over the last 48 to 72 hours, where there are some differences in some of the policies that she is proposing and using her personal story to help talk about that Joe Biden couldn't have done. So I don't think that I really expected much of a difference in the Middle East policies from her and Joe Biden in the time of since she's been the nominee.
Okay. And Kirsten, there's a lot of speculation about what the Arab American vote might look like in Michigan, and particularly for Republicans running Trump and on down. Is it your expectation that we're looking at some number of Arab Americans who are going to be voting for the Republican, or is it more likely that these former Democratic voters are simply going to sit it out because they can't stomach voting for Harris or a Democrat?
That was my gut when you were talking to Rebecca about that with the 70% vote went Democrat. I don't see them coming to the Republican Party. I think they probably are just disaffected and probably don't vote. But it's possible. I mean, I think that some of them are probably single issue voters, and so that's I think those people, that they probably sit it out. But those who maybe aren't single issue voters and they want to vote on the economy or something else, they may come to the Republican Party. I think it just is it's going to come down to how fervent is their support for the Palestinian issue, and how do they look at that when they go to the ballot box? Is that number one, or is that number 2 or 3? And I don't think we're going to know that until election day.
And then we get to the women vote. I hate to talk in those terms, but I think that's the way, campaign people think about this. It's an important segment. Democrats have been pretty successful in putting referenda on the ballot. Rebecca, are you expecting these efforts by Democrats to succeed in getting a strong turnout that would be, kind of supportive of reproductive rights and helpful to the Democratic ticket from Harris on down?
Yeah, I really do. I actually think that Donald Trump and JD Vance are doing a better job at turning out Democratic votes in this instance than perhaps the Democrats could ever have imagined. I think that their talking points and some of the rhetoric that has come out and been amplified by the Harris campaign and Democrats is really what is driving a lot of this enthusiasm for women and reproductive rights voters. So yeah, I think that part's going great. And you're totally right. This is it's a women vote issue, right? And I think you are seeing a lot of enthusiasm amongst women of all ages. There's no age group that this just applies to. I really think it is 18 plus. And so it's pretty ubiquitous too. It's everywhere. It's not just a state or two. I think it's pretty much across the board.
Kirsten, we've talked about this in the past, and I think your advice to Republicans has been something in the order of take a position, have a position with integrity, don't be, flip-flopping around like we've seen Donald Trump and JD Vance doing on some occasions. Do you think Republicans, in competitive races are going to be seriously hurt by abortion, or can they neutralize it?
I think that, a word that Rebecca used that I would agree with, and I think that's where we have a month left, and so we don't know what this is going to look like, but enthusiasm. So right now, as it sits, I am not seeing that the abortion issue is something that is the number 1 or even 2 issue amongst a lot of voters. So I feel like people aren't as enthusiastic about it as we've seen in previous cycles. So if that holds true, then I think Republicans are going to be able to run on other issues, and maybe those other issues will be more top of mind. If Donald Trump and JD Vance continue to make comments about women, I think it only feeds into their position and the changing position on the abortion issue. Then that makes women more enthusiastic to go to the ballot box and vote on what Larry, you called quote unquote women's issues. And so I think it really is going to come down to how inflammatory are their remarks, and I think that's why you see Nikki Haley going out there on Fox News and saying, you need to tone it down. You need to stop talking to women and about women the way that you are using, or the way that you are doing. And so I think, we'll have to see. I do think one thing I've been generally impressed with a lot of Republican candidates this cycle in terms of, this is not the top of the ticket, this is more congressional level. Staking out their position on abortion, being bullish about how they talk about it, and just owning it. And I think that's an important thing to your point, Larry, and what I've said before is you have to stake out a position, you have to own it. And I think a lot of Republican candidates are doing that today. It's just a matter of, the rhetoric that's being used at the top of the ticket and how that drives turnout.
And I will say, I think Kirsten's totally right about congressional Republicans probably having more discipline than the top of their ticket. And that, in my mind, is great for Republicans to stake out an issue that's important to constituents and voters, but it's also probably being overshadowed by a lot of what the top of the ticket is doing. And that's like to their detriment, right? And so it's hard to distance yourself from that top of the ticket, particularly in some of these very, very competitive congressional races where you've got a competitive presidential state. So if you're in a Michigan congressional race and it's already competitive, and then you've got the presidential on top of it, you've got to really work hard to separate yourself from what the national party is doing that you may not agree to, no matter how much hard work you have done to do exactly what Kirsten said, which is like be bullish, stand with integrity, and just figure out what your position is.
Okay, I've got a question for you both about the tens of millions, perhaps billions, are going to be spent on this election, particularly the presidential side. Is that money worth it? I mean, there's such a fevered effort to raise money. We've just talked for 10 or 15 minutes about all these events and different voting groups, and it looks pretty static. And so one answer might be, well, each side is kind of canceling out the other. And so the kind of fevered fundraising is really to make sure that, you've got the ammunition to fight back, or that maybe we're overemphasizing the ads and the campaign strategy and that sort of thing. Kirsten, you're nodding, so.
Yeah, my gut tells me that it unfortunately is necessary, and I think there's a couple of reasons why. One is I think that if you're the Democrat Party and you see some of the polling that had been changing when Joe Biden was still at the top of the ticket, had been changing in Donald Trump's favor. I think a lot of people, the further away we got from Donald Trump being in that White House, and the general public being reminded every single day of his personality and his, the Twitter. I think that people were starting to have a little bit of maybe revisionist history, or it wasn't so bad then, but because it was, several years ago. And so I think the reminder of who Donald Trump is and what he's capable of saying and doing, I think is important for the Harris campaign to do, to kind of reset a little bit. I think it's important too for Republicans, because I think Kamala Harris is trying really hard to kind of reinvent herself in terms of, she is the current vice presidential candidate. Vice president. She's trying to run away from an unpopular administration that she was very much a part of. She's having changing positions on a lot of issues because she's kind of trying to, again, become her own candidate and be a candidate of change, even though she's in the White House. And so I think it's important for Republicans to frame her while she's trying to frame herself. So even though it looks like it's not quote unquote working, or it's not changing anything in the polls. I think that it's important for both sides right now to kind of stake their claim on their messaging.
Rebecca?
I don't know how to get out of this like money system that we are in. It's also like how I make a living. So I don't know that I want us to get out of it, right? So I think money in politics overall is problematic, right? I think that we need to figure out some sort of a campaign finance reform so that there are not billions, guys, like billions of dollars going into this every 2 and 4 years. I do think that there are, Kirsten's right, it is necessary at this point. It just is what it is. This is the game that we are playing, and I think any party or candidate that decides to not play by these rules is hamstringing themselves and won't be able to advance an agenda in elected office. So it's frustrating. I know that there are probably better things we could do with a lot of this money, particularly, hurricane relief. And, I agree that it's all a gross amount of money, but it's also grown so exponentially in the 25 years I have been in this business that it's hard to imagine how much more expensive it could get at the end of every cycle, and yet it does. And so looking forward, what is the next presidential going to cost? What are congressional races going to cost? Because I think the ramp that we have seen here is just, I don't know how to ramp it back down.
So we've been talking about how this is a toss-up election, and we've gone through some of the different groups of voters. And so now we're looking at, okay, what might tilt this election? And one set of potential influences might be the issues in the front of the mind of the voter, particularly those who are, undecided or not quite sure who they're going to support. And Ipsos did a poll just very recently asking voters in the swing states, the key 7 battleground states, what are the important issues? And they are, number 1, inflation, listed by more than half of voters. Number 2, immigration, which was listed by a third. And then the political extremism, polarization, protect democracy theme, which was about a fifth. Rebecca, does that seem about right? And if so, do you think that kind of favors the Republicans, who are kind of better positioned on inflation and immigration?
Yeah, the issues seem right. I don't know that I agree, obviously. Like, I don't know that I agree that Republicans are better positioned. I think that a lot of the statewide Democrats, particularly in US Senate races, are tackling a lot of this at this point, particularly in Pennsylvania, where I'm doing work for the DSCC. And inflation is the number 1 issue by far, and just the price of living your life. I do think it's something that everybody has top of mind, and there's probably not a campaign in America right now that is communicating with voters that is not talking about the economy and inflation and the cost of goods and groceries and gas and healthcare. And so I think it's incumbent on a lot of the down ballot races, particularly congressionals and even US Senate races, to make sure that that marries up with what the presidential is saying, or to figure out how to separate yourself, like I said before, about how to separate on abortion. So that's what I think is happening in a lot of these battlegrounds right now.
And after you've had 3.5 years of the Biden-Harris administration, in which inflation went shooting up and then it's been coming down, how did Democrats handle that so they're not kind of just pulled down by the sense of fear and frustration and pain?
I don't know that we did. I mean, I do think it's a lot of what the Harris-Walz campaign is talking about and hoping to address with some of the proposals that they've come out with and have said that they will do if elected. I do think it's incumbent on those down ballot races to take a look at what's happening in their particular districts or states and talk about what they have done to help combat inflation, the votes they've taken. So running on people's records, I think, is something that I'm seeing a lot of, particularly in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, versus just railing against an administration. So taking their own personal votes and using them to show voters, hey, I am maybe in Washington, but I am not necessarily part of the problem, which I think is like, it's a tough pill for voters to swallow. And sometimes people think it's bullshit, but other times it's you need to make sure that you are coming across as genuine, and you need to have the receipts to back it up, which I think is important here.
Kirsten, you hear Republican consultants and commentators say things like that Donald Trump and Republicans would do better if he played more golf and did less campaigning. And what they mean is that if he ran on the issues. And this seems, at least on these issues, to be a classic, punish the incumbent sort of referendum. Is that the way you see it? Is this kind of like the environment kind of favors Democrats if Donald Trump would get them out of the way?
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely agree that Donald Trump needs to play more golf. His lack of message discipline in a time when I think the Democrats are definitely, their backs are against the wall a little bit. I think you see that in a lot of Democrats are really trying to on the immigration issue. I see a lot of headlines and a lot of comments from Democrats really trying to play tough on border issues. And I don't think you would have seen that if immigration wasn't one of the top issues that voters are caring about right now. I think you're seeing you're seeing Kamala Harris trying to be a change candidate, even though she's somebody who's in the White House. And I think that she's struggling to do that right now. But I think she's doing it because she sees that the issue set is not in her favor at the moment. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's helpful for the Democrats that there was a change at the top. And obviously, we'll have to see how she's able to continue that. I do agree with Rebecca that I do think that down ballot people are having some success where they're saying, one of the candidates that I'm working against, a targeted Democrat in not a battleground state, presidential battleground state, had to take some bad votes in the House. The Inflation Reduction Act is one of them. And so he says, okay, well, I'm going to pick one good thing that was good for my district that was in the, IRA, and I'm going to focus on that, even though Republicans are trying really hard to frame that vote as overall, a really bad vote for the economy. And so I think they're having some success by really localizing and saying, okay, I took that really bad vote because this one thing that you guys really care about. And if I hadn't taken that vote, then where would we be? And so I do think they're having some success. But overall, it is definitely more of an environment for Republicans. We need to see more discipline from the top of the ticket, and I'm not sure Republicans are going to get that.
One of the things we come down the kind of final month is less than 30 days to election day. And then Rebecca and Kirsten, you guys go on vacation.
Right. We do it all again.
Maybe we'll see what happens on election day, but so, there are a couple of areas where you often see campaigns focusing. One is on the so-called undecided voter. They're not a lot. Most overwhelming majority, plus 90%, are locked into one party and one candidate. And people disagree about how many people are truly undecided. Maybe it's 3%, maybe it's 5%, somewhere in there. But the question that I have for you is, how do you think about the inclination of those voters? There's a kind of a rule of thumb that I've heard some people talk about, that if you are undecided, you're not just no idea. You've just watched the incumbent administration for the last 3.5 years. And some of, maybe a majority of those undecided voters are probably going to vote against the incumbent party. And so you kind of look at this as a tied race. And then you look at those 5%, you say, okay, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 are going to break for Donald Trump. Rebecca, does that make sense to you, or does that seem?
I think it depends on the state, and I think it depends on the demographic of who are we talking about as this undecided voter. I would go back to my data team and talk about modeling, like where do these people usually end up? What do I think is going to motivate them? Is it healthcare? Is it abortion? Is it the economy? And maybe it's some combination of 2 or 3 of those. But I really think if you're undecided, you are paying attention. You have an issue or two that will motivate you. And it's up to the campaigns to figure out, how do I go get those people? And I think a lot of this happens with, yes, paid communications, but I do think a field game is where this comes in, where you can actually get out and talk to voters, identify what their issues are, and then make your paid communications targeted to what they tell you at the doors. That takes time. That's probably not going to happen in the last 4 weeks of a campaign. I think undecided voters at this point, we are just banking on getting a percentage of them, right? And sometimes there's undecided voters that I know live in a zip code or a precinct that is predominantly Republican, and I would leave them alone, right? I just wouldn't go turn them out, because my instincts would tell me that the majority of them are going to go vote against my candidate. So why would I bother going to turn them out? So I think it's a game time decision based on where you are, the demographics of that area, and how much money you have. Like, how much money are you going to go spend on undecided voters if they're going to help you lose? Hopefully nothing, but I think that's where I'd go if I were a manager at this point.
Kirsten, what's your thinking about those undecided voters? Would you expect them to generally break towards Trump in the last month or few days?
I would say yes, except if he says something right before they go and vote, right? So I think right now, the way things are at, with where more Republicans are identifying themselves, or more voters are identifying themselves as Republicans right now than they have traditionally. This time, last cycle, I think the Democrats were +7 and Republicans are now +2, which means that was a pretty big swing. And that's very abnormal for Republicans in October of a presidential year to be up on voter identification. So I think that tells me that, all things equal right now, that most of the undecideds are probably going to go Republican. But I think the problem with that is that we have a very unstable top of the ticket that could make that he could really, get himself into some trouble with what he says.
So this is back to the theme of play more golf, Mr. Trump.
Yeah. Also back to the theme of it's like 6 in one, half dozen in another. Like, we don't know.
Hey, I've got a question here, and I'm kind of want to include some of our friends here, who's kind of taking us to task that we're not talking more about the radical Democratic position on abortion. Rebecca, do you see evidence that there's a kind of a sense that Democrats have gone too far, that there are a group of voters out there who might favor rights to reproductive choice, but the Democrats have gone too far? Is that just a Republican talking point, or is there actually a voting constituency in that?
I don't know that I see evidence of that in either polling or regular people I talk to on the campaign trail. So I don't know that I agree necessarily that Democrats have gone further than the voting population. I think that is something that will bear itself out as some of these states have reproductive initiatives on the ballot. I think you saw it in Ohio last year, where I spent 10 years working in Ohio, like living in Columbus, working in Ohio, and I am shocked that passed with the margins that it did. And so I think what you're seeing is maybe a little bit of that as a Republican talking point, but what I think you're seeing is people realizing that your vote is your vote, and you don't have to tell people who you vote for or how you vote. And so you're seeing a lot of people turning out and just being like, yeah, I want this. This is what we're doing. It's under the radar, and I don't know that you see it really play itself out in a poll that may not be focused specifically on reproductive rights. Because when you're doing a presidential poll, you've got 40 questions. How deep are you going to get on repro if you've also got to talk about the economy, inflation, healthcare, sort of democracy? It's tough to do in a poll.
And so, Kirsten, are you seeing much movement among voters for this Republican talking point about the Democrats being too radical on abortion, or is it just the positioning of each party and this kind of radical portrayal of the Democratic position is not really registering that much?
So my sense is that in polling, voters generally do not like the Democrats' position on like what is being called the radical, the up until birth, basically talking point. Vote that does bear out in polling. However, I don't think it moves any voters. So you have women, even Republican women, independent women, and obviously Democrat women who are voting on this issue not because of the number of weeks that abortion is allowed till, or none of that matters. What matters is it's now being viewed as you're taking away a choice that I think I should have and other women should have. It doesn't matter number of weeks or when, how, all the things. It's being seen as just a woman's choice, and that's how I'm voting on it. So even though they don't believe that abortion should be allowed up until birth, that they would never personally do it, they don't want their friends and family to do it, that's not how they're voting. If that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't super make sense to me, but I think that's how it's bearing out in voting trends and in polling.
Right. So one influence on the outcome of this very close election will be what happens with the undecided voters. Another is who votes. We were talking earlier about maybe Arab Americans in Michigan just sitting it out. And then you have just every election, you have what sometimes referred to as peripheral voters or infrequent voters who come in and out, and each campaign puts a lot of money and time into trying to make sure their voters get out and cast the ballot. Rebecca, how would you size up how each party is doing in terms of their effort to identify and turn out voters?
I mean, my sense is it's going great. Like I feel like there is activity everywhere. And I think this goes for both Democrats and Republicans, just in terms of the amount of texts I get about supporting people and do I want to go knock on doors? But I do think that field efforts are back to pre-COVID, which is great, back to pre-COVID levels. So you're seeing more and more enthusiasm for doing things like knocking on doors on beautiful days like today, making sure that we are figuring out who those undecided voters are and how to get to them. I think there's also, the typical way that I would do this is, you want to make sure your base is covered too, and making sure you're getting those people out while you're still trying to turn out those persuadable undecided voters. So it's a two-track that goes from now until election day. I think in particular right now, for a lot of states where the early vote is already happening, this is happening now. It is get out the vote time in a lot of states where you haven't had the early voting laws as they are now. So things have changed certainly since 2020, but they change a little bit every year. So I think it goes without saying that it's a longer period of time to go turn out those voters and figure out who's on the table for you and who's off the table.
And there's been close tracking of voter registration in the state of Pennsylvania, which could be the pivot state in terms of electoral college, and collecting data from the Pennsylvania Department of State and their voter registration data. It appears that the Republicans have built up an advantage in terms of voter registration. This is not common. What's going on in Pennsylvania? Do you buy that the Republicans are just kind of doing a better job there?
Yeah, with registrations, yes. So the article you sent me yesterday was very surprising. I was not aware of some of the registration shifts. I think the registration shift is one thing, but what I will say is the registration shift doesn't matter as much if you're not turning out your voters. So when they register these voters, they've got to figure out how to track all these people, how to make sure that they know how to vote, know when to vote, all of those sorts of things. So when you are out there registering, that's great, but you've got a responsibility then to make sure that you're getting those voters out to do what you registered them to do, which is vote.
Kirsten, does it look to you like the get out the vote efforts and organization by the Republicans is really quite stellar?
No, I do not actually believe that. I think that there's a lot of activity. I think there's a few unknowns, though. I think that this cycle, yes, I think we've made up some ground, particularly in Pennsylvania, but I think a lot of other places in voter registration, and there was a lot of outside money and money that was used for that. And we've been talking about that as Republicans for a very long time, and we've been behind. And so I think it's positive. But to Rebecca's point, I think that we're now probably several cycles behind on our get out the vote efforts to those people. And so, and that happens at the same time that my understanding, when I worked at the Republican National Committee, we owned a lot of the voter turnout efforts in a lot of these states. It was called the Victory Program. My understanding as an outsider now is that the Trump campaign is not really doing that out of the Republican National Committee. In fact, a lot of it is being done by Elon Musk's outside group, and there's been some tumult about the organization there. And it's interesting because they, in a lot of ways, took what Ron DeSantis was trying to do during the primary with his voter contact by doing it outside of the actual campaign and trying to do it with an outside group. And so I think there's going to be a lot of questions, after we see the results here and who actually came to the polls in these states. There's going to be a lot of questions over operationally, was that the right decision, and did it work, and will it be replicated? I think that's fair to say that Ron DeSantis's operation did not work in the primary. So why would you model your general election campaign in that way? So I don't know. We don't know exactly how that's going to work. And so I don't, it's going to be interesting just to see how much we trail the registrations in a state like Pennsylvania. I also think too, one of the dynamics that we don't, it's just another unknown is, just because Republican registrations are up in some of these states, do they go to the polls for Donald Trump? I think there's a shift that started in 2016, but I think it's not fully over. And I think we saw that in the primary with Nikki Haley voters that are not Trump voters potentially. And so just because you're registered as a Republican, how does that impact your actual vote? And I also think that the same is true on the Democrat side, where I think that there's kind of a shift of this populist, and are Democrats losing some of the kind of middle class because they're going over to Donald Trump. And so they see themselves as a registered Democrat, but they may go and actually vote for Trump. And so I think we're having more of a realignment. It's not fully over yet. And that we'll have to see how that bears out with registrations afterward.
Yeah, I would maybe describe what's going on, and I agree with what you just said, as de-alignment, meaning that the voters are kind of falling off from the parties for various reasons. Kirsten, we actually have questions here that I think is relevant. And they're basically saying, what about conservative voters who have doubts about the Trump-Vance ticket? Loyal Republican voters who have doubts about it, or the influence of prominent Republican politicians like Dick Cheney and a host of people in the military who are warning about Donald Trump. Do you see that playing into this looseness of maybe some of the Republican vote for Donald Trump in particular?
Yeah, I think even just professionally in my conversations I have and looking at the type of Republicans that I work with and for, and I think that there's going to be, it's going to be interesting. There's going to be some Republicans who were Nikki Haley primary voters who are going to hold their nose and they're going to vote for Donald Trump. And it's because they view Kamala Harris as too extreme. It's the California liberal. I definitely can't vote for Kamala Harris. Then you're going to have your kind of Dick Cheneys and Liz Cheney's who are going to say, no, Donald Trump is that much of a threat, and I can't sit out. I can't let it be, because I think there's an argument that sitting out in a lot of states like Wisconsin, et cetera, sitting out is probably a vote for Donald Trump in some ways, right? And so I think then you have to stake out a claim and you're going to vote for Kamala Harris. And then you're going to have the people that I run into quite frequently who are saying right now, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't think I can vote. I can't vote for any of these people. Jokingly, do you want to be written in on my ballot? And I think that there is probably almost equal thirds of those kind of that subset of voter that they're going to fall in those three categories. And we don't know how many people that encompasses right now.
Rebecca, we've got several questions on the theme of can America elect a woman as president? And this, of course, has been a concern with Hillary Clinton's campaign and now with Kamala Harris. Do you see that as a factor, that there's a group of voters, perhaps some people have talked about Black men, who just have a hard time voting for a woman as president? Or is that being washed out by the partisanship and the other issues we've been talking about?
I actually think it still permeates despite all of the partisanship and everything that has happened in the last 6 months, sort of globally and here in the US. So I do think it's still an issue that is something to be tackled and to be considered. I have seen some interesting trends in some of the Pennsylvania polling I have seen where, you know, the shift from Biden to Harris is not favorable, right? And I don't know, is that because she's a woman? Is it because she's Black? Is it because she's lesser known? In my mind, it is, it's a little bit of everything. And so I can't pin it all on sort of the sexism, can a woman become president? But it feels like that, right? Like those are the vibes that some of these polling briefings I am getting are giving in some of these states with a lot of rural populations that don't have women elected to Congress, don't have women elected as mayors. And it's just something that they're maybe not used to, which is crazy to say in 2024, but I think it's a reality that we have to take into consideration as we head into election day. I don't like the idea of saying like, yeah, I think that's a big consideration here, particularly as we are, 30 days out and there's nothing to do to change the top of the ticket. And, Kirsten and I have both worked for women that ran for president, and we deeply believed that they could win. So it's kind of a tough thing to say, like, yeah, I think it's a problem in some parts of America.
Kirsten, do you see it as a problem?
Yes. I definitely saw it in our primary, and that was probably worse ground to run on, right? In a Republican primary as a woman, I think is worse ground than what Kamala Harris is trying to achieve. But yes, I think that, the more rural, the more conservative places that in America, I think are going to have a little bit of a harder time, but it is hard to isolate, right? So I completely agree with Rebecca in terms of, is it that people, identify her as unserious? Is that because she is unserious, or because she's a woman and so they're more apt to think that she's unserious? Some of these questions, I don't know, right? I do think that there is something about, perception, and that, things would come out of Nikki Haley's mouth and Donald Trump's mouth, and they would be perceived differently coming out of Nikki Haley's mouth. I do think that was real in the primary. And so I think that that's happening most likely to Kamala Harris too. So it's difficult, but yes, in the short, yes, it is happening and is a problem.
I want to shift to the federal elections. I know you both work there. And like the presidential election looks pretty darn close. If you look at Real Clear Politics or Cook Report, they're basically saying there's about 10 to a dozen seats in the, that there's 2-3 dozen seats for the House that appear to be toss-ups. And, they're kind of split evenly, maybe a little bit more from the Democratic side. I noticed in New York, there are 4 toss-ups. New York is considered a liberal bastion, but, those seats will be important for which party gets the majority. So very close in the House, maybe again, a squeaker of a majority for either party. And then in the Senate, it looks as if the Republicans are on track to pick up 2 seats and to reverse the Democratic 1-seat majority. Does that strike you as kind of in the ballpark? And where do you see these races heading? Kirsten?
Yeah, I think that the Senate, I think that that's probably roughly where it stands. I think that the House, I don't know that, I think that's really a jump ball. I think that it's not going to be, a landslide either way. I think that if Speaker Johnson keeps his speaker's gavel, I'm not sure I would want that job again. And so I think we're going to see a lot of antics there if that's the case. But yeah, I work in several of those districts that are very much on the bubble, and I think that I think those are going to get dragged by the top of the ticket. I think right now we're still in this kind of, that they're trying to separate themselves and localize the races as much as they can. But I think ultimately in the next couple of weeks, it's going to end up being very reflective of the top of the ticket.
And is that your view, Rebecca? This is going to be kind of driven by what's going on with Harris and Trump?
Yes, I think the only exception I would add to that, and I think you're right about the New York districts, but I think the maps there are really what makes those races competitive. I don't think it's a personality or record or quality of the candidate thing. I think it's logistically just the maps. With the House, I do think there are all of those competitive seats. The problem with figuring out who the speaker is going to be quickly is going to be California. And a lot of those races that are toss-ups, that have vacancies because of retirements or people moving on, there's probably a half dozen of them that will not be called until a week to 10 days after the election, which is probably what the margins are. It's going to be within the margin of error here on who controls the House. So that's what I am looking at is the waiting game in California and figuring out how long is it going to take for those races to be called. And I think that's why you're seeing such an influx of money, both for Democrats and Republicans, particularly in places like Orange County, Riverside County, some of the Central Valley, where Republicans currently hold seats, but where Democrats certainly have an opportunity to make some pickups there.
And, we were talking about the Senate shifting by one vote, perhaps, to the Republicans, but there's actually, a handful of these Republican Democratic battles, particularly seats held currently by Democrats, that are close. They're about 3 points separating the two candidates. Rebecca, does that surprise you that Democrats, are facing these tight races with incumbents who, have some following?
No, I think I would have expected the Democrats to have tight races, particularly at this point in a cycle where our U.S. Senate map matches up with the battleground presidential map almost perfectly right now. And so you've got Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin up. Those are 4 incumbents for Democrats. They're in incredibly tight races. What I am surprised by is an investment in Texas and Florida, which I have thought Florida was gone for Democrats since 2004. So when I saw that investment come through a couple of weeks ago, I'm surprised by that. I'm very surprised by what's happening in Texas and also Nebraska, which we mentioned at the top of this call. And, maybe those are head fakes. Maybe they're just outliers in terms of the polling. Maybe they are completely out of reach. But I think this is the fun part of the cycle where you get some October surprises about hey, maybe Nebraska is a thing for Democrats and maybe it hasn't been off the table this entire time and we just needed to figure out what the right formula is. Or Deb Fischer could win by 10. There's just no way to know until this completely plays all the way out, which I think is really, it's the fun part of doing this job.
We had a program last week with several scholars who were looking at conservative voters of color. And they were using polling data. They were also, kind of studying voters of color and how they're appraising the Democratic Party and the two candidates. And I'd say the conclusion was real frustration among voters of color with the Democratic Party, particularly Black men and Hispanic men. And the arguments that Trump makes about America, failing appears to be resonating. Not that there is attraction to his policies, but that his diagnosis is resonating and peeling off, not a huge numbers, but some proportion of once reliable Democratic voters. Rebecca, are you seeing any of that, or is that a mistake?
No, I think it happens every cycle, and it's not just Trump. I think that there are Black Republicans, and that is something that I think is it surprises Democratic consultants every time we see it in a poll or see a validator that's a Republican, but it's a reality. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't think is weird. So it's no surprise to me that some of Trump's talking points are making inroads here, but I don't think it is, you know, an epidemic. It's not something that I'm completely worried about. I think as long as Kamala Harris stays within what Joe Biden was getting in terms of African American and Latino support, she will be fine in all of these places. And I think you've seen her support levels amongst Black Americans go up from where Joe Biden was, which I think is an important marker here too.
Kirsten, do you agree with that?
I would say yes, because unfortunately, while to your point, Donald Trump is good at prescribing the part of the problem, which I think there is with some of the Democrat policies, and that's a reason why they're seeing some shifts. I think that unfortunately they're not going to have a home in the Republican Party until we start figuring out some of our policies that can attract them to actually come and stay with the party, right? And so I think that I think that's why they, Rebecca's probably right not to be too concerned by it, but I do think that it's probably in the next cycle or two something that both parties are going to have to think through how, what their policies are doing for different sectors of the population and how to actually achieve some progress.
Great, we're almost out of time, and I want to just get to Election Day and the closing weeks. There's a lot of concern that we may see artificial intelligence playing a role. If you look at the recent United Kingdom vote, there were some, shocking developments of, we had a manufactured image of a prominent conservative saying outlandish things, and there wasn't enough time or effective way to respond to that. Do you fear that AI might, manipulate this final period of the election and have an impact? Kirsten?
Yes, it seems like the last couple election cycles, especially presidential, there's been bad actors internationally, and I do worry that they're kind of waiting in the wings to see what they can do, to heavily influence our elections. So yes, I do worry about it. I also worry, and I know we don't have much time to explore this, but I also worry just about some of the election day operations, like election integrity stuff that I think we're going to see, especially with some of the hurricanes and the weather that's going to impact voting. So just something else that keeps me up at night.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think seeing AI in campaigns is something that is kind of, it's actually really scary. I think that yes, AI can be a force for good. I think that when there are bad actors utilizing AI, that's where you see problems. We haven't seen anything that dramatic quite yet, but it doesn't mean it can't happen in the next 27, 28 days. And I think that as AI iterates and has no regulation by any FEC or campaign bodies or the US government or state governments, we're sort of opening ourselves up to what can AI do to campaigns, and how do we harness and regulate this in a way that makes sure that campaigns and candidates are being truthful about what they're saying and how they're portraying, getting their message across.
Yeah, and the manufacturing of, it was the prime minister before the last election who was, concocted. It was manufactured, and it had an effect. Well, I want to thank you both. This was another fantastic conversation. I know a lot of folks have benefited from your wisdom and your candor. Thank you for that. I want to just mention, yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I want to just mention we've got our last program in our election series this year. On October 30th, my colleague Catherine Pearson is going to be talking with a very prominent congressional expert on what's going on in the congressional election. So if you'd like to dig in more on that, this is going to be a terrific program. That's October 30th, 12 Central Time. I also want to take a second, since this is the last program that I'll be hosting, to thank the people who make this possible. And two in particular, I'd like to thank Lee Chittenden. Lee, are you here? Yeah, there's Lee. Lee is like this force behind the scenes and who makes this all possible. So thank you so much, Lee. And then Cody Jackett, who's responsible for putting together today's program in particular. Thank you, Cody. We appreciate the hard work you're doing. Great. Let me just mention, if you like this program, you can get the podcast of it in a day or two. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll email out information about that in a day or two. Finally, if you'd like to support this kind of programming, we need financial support to make it possible. So we encourage you to consider making a donation, and here's some information for that. Once again, though, thank you to our two terrific guests, Rebecca Pearcey and Kirsten Kukowski. Thank you. You guys are awesome. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a great day, and remember, it's your duty to vote.